what I'd like to show you here is how to rig up a couple of different styles of rods for blackfish fishing. So I've already talked a little bit about the rod and reel and the line that I'm using, which is this 12-pound float line. And I want to show you what to do with that and how to put a rig together, both for fishing on the ocean rocks like we are here, and then on that second rod on how to rig up to fish in an estuary location with a slightly different variation. So the first thing I'm going to do is put on the float that I'm going to use here. This particular float is just a homemade blackfish float. It's basically a satay skewer with a shaped wine cork. The only problem is you have to drink the wine to get the cork, but that's okay. With a fluorescent painted top so that you can see it quite clearly when it's floating through the water. The idea with blackfish fishing is that when a float's in the water, only the mast should be above the level of the water. So you are going to weigh that float so that it is suspended in the water. When you fish off the ocean rocks, you don't want the float moving up and down or laying over. So we use what we call a fixed float. On the top is bound a cut safety pin to act as a runner, and the line in the first instance goes through that runner. Then on the bottom of the shaped satay skewer, you use a piece of plastic flex, which you can buy in lengths at hobby shops or even buy old skipping ropes and cut them up. You thread the line through the flex and run it up the line a couple of metres to roughly the depth that you're going to set the float at, and then you pop the flex onto the bottom of the float like so. Not too tight, tight enough to hold it at the depth you want it, but loose enough so you can alter the float. So if you want to go deeper or shallower, you can just slide it on the line. So that sets your depth. The next thing you do is, as I mentioned earlier, use some form of fluorocarbon leader. Now that's to minimise the visibility to the blackfish, which are quite a shy fish and can see heavy line. And basically what you're aiming at is something that's about 0.20 millimetres in diameter as your starting point. In some circumstances you might even go finer than that, and in some very rough circumstances you might go a little bit heavier, perhaps to 0.25. But the diameter's the important thing, not the breaking strain. 0.20 millimetre fluorocarbon line can range anything from 5 pounder to 10 or 11 pounds. And this particular one, despite being only 0.20 millimetre, is rated at 11 pound or 5 kilos, which is about the outside range. Quite often though, a line in that diameter would be rated at about 6 pound breaking strain or 3 kilos. So what I've done is already rigged a trace, and I'll show you what I mean by that now. What I've done is cut a length of that fluorocarbon line, about 1 metre or so, and I've tied it to a very small swivel, about a size 14 swivel. On the other end of that fluorocarbon line, I've tied a small hook using a uni knot. The pattern's not critical, it's the style of hook that you like, and you can use a variety of patterns and a variety of brands, but it should be around a size 10 or a size 8, depending on the size of the blackfish you're anticipating. You go perhaps for an 8 in an ocean situation like this, and a 10 if you were fishing in a lake or a river. You then use split shot sinkers. These are size 1 split shot sinkers, and for this ocean situation what I've done is put the first two about 30 centimetres up from the hook. So you can probably see those first two split shot crimp there on the line, and I'll show you how to crimp in a minute when we get to the main line. And then about another 20 centimetres up I've got another 3 shot, and they form the primary weight that will bring that float down so that only the mast is showing above the water level. So once I've got that trace rigged up like that, you just attach it to the float line below the float using the traditional or trusty old uni knot. So just a 4-wrap uni knot, moisten it, and then just trim off the tag. So then you've got your swivel attached, and for this particular float, I know it will take about 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, about 7 number 1 shot. So I'm going to put 2 extra shot above the swivel to give that buoyancy that I'm looking for. Now when you buy the shot, they'll be open. And a lot of people think that once you've used them once, you've got to throw them away because they're closed, but you don't. You can reuse your shot by lining up the split at 90 degrees and just squeezing them with the pliers like that, and the shot will reopen, which means you can use them over and over again. You put the shot onto the line and you just crimp it with enough pressure so that it's fixed in a point. Now that means you've now got a rigged fixed float, and you'll adjust that float on the line dependent on the depth of the water that you're fishing. So if you know you're fishing into 15 foot of water, you'd set that float at about 12 foot so that the bait is sitting a couple of foot off the bottom. If the water was only 6 foot deep, you'd set that float at about 5 feet so that the bait's sitting about a foot off the bottom. And that's the advantage of that fixed float. You can adjust it really quickly. What I've just shown you is how to rig up traditionally for blackfish fishing. So using the traditional rod, centre pin, reel and fixed float that we'd use in an ocean fishing situation. But if you were fishing a harbour wharf or in a river or a lake, you would use a lighter version of that float, which would take less shot. That one's had a lot of work, as you can see, but you'll see that it's a slimmer design, designed to have less resistance. What I just want to discuss briefly now is really 3 variations on what I've shown you, and 2 of those variations are about the rod and the reel. So this is a telescopic rod. I haven't extended it, but it's got very much similar characteristics to the rod I've shown you earlier. On that, I've got a centre pin reel that has 1 variation as well. This particular one is also a side cast reel. So if you're looking for something that's more of an all-round set of fishing tackle, something that you can use to have a throw in the estuary or even off the beach for whiting and brim, this is a good reel because you can use it traditionally as a centre pin. It's got the same ball race in the centre as the one that I showed you earlier, but it's got that added advantage that if you want to double it for a whiting or brim reel, you can use it as a side cast reel. Now, I've put that on that telescopic rod just to demonstrate that, and that would not be by any means a bad choice for a fisherman that might be going to fish on holidays once or twice a year and just want something that they can tuck in the boot, use both for blackfish fishing and, as I said, for a throw off the beach or a fish for brim or whiting. So I won't extend that rod, but what I want to show you is the variation on the rig that you would use if you were fishing in an estuary or off a wharf, particularly for blackfish. The only limitation with the fixed float rig that we talked about earlier is that you can't really set it much deeper than the length of the rod. So if you're using an 11-foot rod or a 12-foot rod, the maximum depth that you can fish is about a foot over that length, because obviously you can't wind the float through the tip runner of the rod, and when you're landing the fish, you've got 11 or 12 foot of line down to the fish. So practically, that's as deep as you can set it. In some estuary situations where you're fishing for blackfish, say off a wharf in Sydney Harbour, the water might be 25 feet deep or 8 metres. You might want your bait to be down about 8 metres, down near the bottom where the fish are feeding. And so that fixed float's not going to be any good to you. So what you do is use a running float. And the way you rig a running float for blackfish, is first to take a small bead, much like the bead that whiting fishermen use to put on the top of their hooks. And the first thing you do is put that bead onto the line, just running free like that onto the line. The second thing you then do is thread your float onto the line, this time through 2 runners. So unlike with the fixed float where you're using a piece of flex at the bottom to fix the float, this time the float is running free on the line, following that bead up. So at this stage you've just got a bead and a float. The next part of the rig would be to tie the swivel onto the line, uni knot again, and then you'll find that your float runs down to the swivel. So if you look at that rig now, you've got the float sitting right on the swivel and you've got the bead above the float. You then decide roughly how deep you want to set that float, and that can be anything, any depth you like. It can be a couple of metres or it can be 6 or 8 metres. But the thing that's essential is that you have to put onto that line a stopper, so that when the float is dropped into the water and underneath that swivel you've got the same rig as I showed you before with the split shot and hook, that the float will then run up the line to the depth that you want it to be set. And there are various ways of using stoppers, but I find the easiest, cheapest and most efficient is to use what's called a special stopper knot. And all you do is cut a few centimetres of your main line and you use this stopper knot, which goes like this. It's 3 wraps around the line at about the point that you want to set it, and it's like a granny knot, and then you do 3 wraps in the opposite direction and make a knot like so. You then just tighten it down and trim off the tags so that you've got about 1 centimetre or so either side of the knot. So it just looks like a knot on the line. When you throw the float into the water then, it will run up until the bead hits that knot, and that's the depth that you'll be set at. So when you hook a fish, you might have 8 metres of line between that stopper and the fish, but of course the float just drops back down. So when you get the fish to the surface, you've only got the length of the trace. That particular knot is a knot on the line, so it doesn't weaken the line. It's not a knot in the line, and it's adjustable, so you can pull it like that and change the depth. So if you start fishing at 8 metres and you think, well, that's too deep, I'll come back to 7 metres, you can just slide it with your thumbnail down the line, or if you want to go deeper, you can slide it up. And that gives you a lot of flexibility as a rig if you're fishing in deep water positions. There's also an argument too that the actual strike and hooking up of the fish is more efficient if the line slides through the float, because you're not actually dragging the float towards you, you're actually pulling the line through the float. So that's the still water variation on the rig I showed you first up.
Well, John, we've caught a couple of fish today, so that's it's been a success. Thanks for showing us how to do it. And yeah, it's been great.
It's a pleasure, Scott. It's been good fun, and we might clean a couple of these for your dinner, I think, mate. What do you reckon?
Sounds good.
All right.